Welcome to our program on the Quad and potential for future collaboration. We have a terrific lineup of speakers with us, with representatives from Japan, Australia, and India. As background reading, our global CEO and former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, wrote an op-ed just this week in Foreign Affairs on why the Quad alarms China. A link to that article, if you haven't read it yet, is in the chat box. This is program 2 of 8 in our Seeking Truth Through Facts U.S. China program series. Up next are programs on technology and the Belt and Road, and they will lead up to our 4th annual Future of U.S. China conference in January 2022. Welcome today to our advisory board members, our honorary chair, Ken Wilcox, and our new chair, Gary Reichel. We're pleased to have with us too our groundbreaker and innovator members, and all of our board and those groundbreaker and innovator members should have received a VIP reception link in the same email that you received this program link, and you should use that second link at the end of our session for the VIP reception with all of our speakers. We look forward to seeing you there. I'm Margaret Conley, the Executive Director of our Northern California Center. Our format for today, I'll introduce our moderator, Kay Magistad. She'll introduce our 4 expert speakers. They'll have a moderated discussion and then open it up to audience Q&A. If you have a question for any of our speakers, and we definitely want to hear from you, please type them in the Q&A box, and Mary Kay will be monitoring that throughout the program. We have an hour for this event. We'll finish at 6 p.m. Pacific. Speaker bios are on our website and in the chat box. This event is on the record. We are recording, and the video will be made available on our website afterwards. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Mary Kay Magistad. Mary Kay is a new colleague at Asia Society, now serving as the Associate Director of the Center on U.S. China Relations. She has a podcast called On China's New Silk Road. Be sure to check it out. It's excellent reporting. Mary Kay has been a long time, she's had a lot of experience reporting throughout Asia. She opened NPR's first Beijing bureau in the mid-90s and returned for the BBC PRX program, The World, in 2003. She was NPR's Southeast Asia correspondent. She has reported in every province in China. Mary Kay has degrees from Northwestern University and Sussex University in England. She's been a Nieman Fellow and Radcliffe Fellow at Harvard, and she's received many awards, including the Overseas Press Club and DuPont Columbia. Mary Kay, thank you for moderating today. It is all yours.
Thanks, Margaret, for that generous introduction, and thank you all for being here. So, as we all know, China has had an extraordinary few decades of economic growth, and it's come to the end of what Deng Xiaoping used to call the era where China was supposed to hide its strength and bide its time. We're in an era now where Xi Jinping has a very clear idea of what he'd like China to do in the world, and in the realm of unintended consequences, people are starting to decide in different parts of the world that they might want to pull in a different direction. So the Quad is one of those possible coalitions. It's an idea that's been kicking around for almost 2 decades, since the 2004 tsunami, when Australia, India, Japan, and the United States all worked together on the disaster response. And Japan's prime minister at the time, Shinzo Abe, said, basically, hey, if we can do this here, why don't we try to do this on a regular basis related to regional security? The timing wasn't right. The response back then was tepid. The United States was focused on the war on terror and wanted China on side, or at least not creating problems. Australia and India felt they had more to gain from economic engagement with China than by making China feel like regional powers were working together to contain it. And years went by. Now, you heard Margaret mention Kevin Rudd's article. In it, his opening lines talk about how as recently as 2017, China's foreign minister referred to the Quad, saying it's like froth on the ocean waves. It might get some attention momentarily, and then it'll dissipate. But of course, it hasn't. And now China's leaders are worried and a little indignant at what they perceive as an attempt to thwart China's rightful rise. So where is all this leading? Is China right in worrying that the Quad might become a new NATO for East Asia? And whether it is or not, what would be the smartest way forward for a strengthened Quad that would deter conflict in the region rather than unintentionally provoke it? Joining us to discuss all this and more are deeply knowledgeable experts from each country in the Quad, and I'll introduce them here. Bonnie Glaser is the director of the German Marshall Fund of the United States Asia Program. She has for 3 decades focused on the intersection of Asia-Pacific geopolitics and U.S. policy, with a particular focus on Taiwan. And she's been a consultant for U.S. government offices, including the State Department and the Department of Defense. Aparna Pande is director of the Hudson Institute's Initiative on the Future of India and South Asia. Her most recent book, which came out this year, is called Making India Great, The Promise of a Reluctant Global Power. Guy Boekenstein is an inaugural Northern Australian Fellow at the Asia Society Australia and Senior Director for National Security and Defence at the Department of the Chief Minister and Cabinet of Australia's Northern Territory Government. And Yuki Tatsumi is Senior Fellow and Co-Director at the Stimson Center's East Asia Program and Director of its Japan Program. She's a seasoned analyst and author on the U.S. Japan Alliance. I'm going to start with Bonnie. To start with, Bonnie, walk us through why two successive U.S. administrations, first Donald Trump's and now Joe Biden's, are prioritizing the Quad. Why the increased U.S. focus on the Quad as a particular way of protecting U.S. interests in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, thank you, Mary Kay, and also thank you to all of those who joined us today and to the Asia Society for focusing on this topic today and having me on. I think that the Quad is really a set of countries that just naturally share a really significant amount of interests and, more importantly, vision, really, for the Indo-Pacific region. This Quad leaders, when they met in March, issued a statement and they said, we strive for a region that is free, open, inclusive, healthy, anchored by democratic values and unconstrained by coercion. And I think that's a really excellent summary of the elements of the vision that the Quad countries want to see. And they recognize that by strengthening cooperation, they advance the possibility that this vision can be realized, that they can strengthen and even improve the rules-based regional order and prevent China from becoming dominant in the region. So the Quad countries, I think, very much have a positive agenda that, of course, includes, again, all of these things that they laid out in the statement. But I think underpinning this, the urgency now that is perceived by many of the Quad countries to do more together is the growing concern about Chinese policies and behavior. And these countries see that China has ambitions in the region that include weakening the presence of the United States, undermining the norms that have underpinned the international order. And they see China employing economic coercion against some of these individual countries, like in the past, Japan, and today, Australia. And so they very much oppose some of these actions by China in the South China Sea and elsewhere. So they're not trying to contain China, but they want to provide alternatives to countries in the region to China, particularly Southeast Asia. They want to strengthen governance and prevent China from pushing its governance model throughout the region. And we saw when the Quad met in March that they agreed to have this vaccine initiative to provide public goods, especially to Southeast Asia. And that's very important for a region that is prioritizing COVID recovery and economic development. So I think these are some of the reasons that are the aspects that are motivating the members of the Quad to work together.
So that's how the Quad's viewing it. How is China viewing what the Quad is doing at the moment?
Well, as you said, when the Quad, first emerged in the first decade of this century, China dismissed it because it was very confident at the time that the members really lacked sufficient shared interest to act collectively. But the second iteration of the Quad, which really began in 2017, has proven to be more effective, and China is definitely more concerned. I think Xi Jinping has the ambition to make China a leading economic, technological, and military power. And in order to do so, he has to persuade other countries to defer to Chinese interests. If the Quad is successful, then other countries may get more spine. They may be more willing to stand up to China. The Quad may actually work with them. And so I think this is particularly true in Southeast Asia. And the Quad poses a challenge to China because it comprises, these four large influential democracies that have the potential to balance effectively against China. And I think Chinese efforts to drive a wedge between the Quad countries and between their economic and security interests have failed. So the Chinese are accusing the Quad members of, as you said, establishing an Asian NATO, even starting a new Cold War, using multilateralism as a pretext to stir up ideological confrontation. But, so far the Chinese have failed to slow the Quad's progress.
Okay. One more quick question. Well, maybe it's not a quick question for you, Bonnie. Since you focus on Taiwan, or you have focused on Taiwan over the years, how do you see the way that China's viewing the Quad and the challenge that it poses to China's interests in its backyard, as China perhaps is increasingly thinking of the first island chain and inside of it? Do you think that this could provoke an action that might not otherwise have been taken related to Taiwan or to the South China Sea, if the perception is we have a window in which to act before it becomes too difficult because of this new coalition?
Well, I would say briefly that as far as the South China Sea is concerned, China's actions have already substantially changed the status quo in the South China Sea in China's favor. So I think that our top priority should not be avoiding provocation of China. We don't want to incite a war. We shouldn't operate in ways that could cause a crisis or conflict. But I think that we really need to be working collectively to alter Xi Jinping's calculus and to change China's coercive behavior against countries in the region. If we cannot do that, then these countries will eventually accommodate to China because they will see that as the only way to protect some of their interests. They will have to yield and make some concessions to China. But Taiwan, I would say, is somewhat different. It is notable that in the Quad statement from March, Taiwan was not included. And we have seen the mention of the importance of preservation of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait in summit statements between President Biden and Prime Minister Suga from Japan, and with President Moon from Korea, and in 3 documents that were signed in Europe, including by the G7 and NATO. So the Quad has yet to act, I think, in any way that really has direct relevance to Taiwan. Now, we might see that going forward. It could be a diplomatic action. It could be helping with vaccines. It could be a joint statement. It certainly could eventually be something like a military exercise if there is a perception that China is moving toward potentially using force against Taiwan. But so far, we've seen very little in terms of actions in Taiwan. And it would be interesting when you talk to Aparna to ask her about maybe whether India has the appetite to do anything with Taiwan.
Yeah. We'll get to that. But first, Yuki. So Japan was the country that first suggested the formation of the Quad. But as you've said previously, nothing but continental drift is going to change the fact that Japan and China are neighbors. So that Japan will always try to seek a relationship with China that's functional. But given how China's leaders are increasingly seeing the Quad, what's the strategy in Japan, within the Japanese government, to find the right balance to keep the relationship functional, and functional in what way or ways?
Thanks, Mary Kay, and thank you again for Asia Society of Northern California to hosting me for today. And thank you everyone for logging on today to watch our discussion on this fascinating topic. So going back to your question, Japan has been in the constant balancing mode between whether to engage China more or whether to be a little bit more focusing on the deterrent aspect of its relations with China. But I think what is very notable, it really did start when Shinzo Abe was a prime minister for the first time in between 2006 and 2007, and when he And when he talked about, first he talked about the confluence of two oceans between Pacific and the Indian Ocean. And then he basically carried that mantra again after he came back to the office in December 2012. And he just pressed forward with that concept of free and open in the Pacific. I think that the expression that he used, the free and open, really speaks to the conundrum that Japan is. That Japan does need to leave a window open to engage China. Thus, the open part comes in on their concept. Mm. But there is really the conviction of, this Indo-Pacific region needs to be free, and free in terms of upholding the universal values, in terms of freedom of navigations, freedom of overflight, supporting universal norms, rule of law. So thus there's that free part. But then open means as long as a country abide by those values, doors open. So I think that really kind of sums up the conundrum that Japan is when Japan looks at China. But China isn't really helping Japan's cause in terms of trying to keep this concept open by increasingly resorting to aggressive behavior, both in East and the South China Sea. And as many of us noted, the Japan's defense white paper, which just came out earlier this month, really did explicitly talked about how stability of Taiwan Strait is in Japan's critical national interest, for the first time. And then, as you have been observing in the media, more and more prominent Japanese political leaders began to talk more openly about Japan needs to be ready to help United States defend Taiwan if Chinese ambition really came to the fore. So I think the balancing act is very complicated part in Japan. Big part of Japanese business still is very much gravitated toward sustained economic engagement with China. But the national security interest of Japan and the concerns about the supply chain resiliency and the safety of those, those strategic materials and critical technologies and emerging technologies, and how that needs to be protected in the way that it's not abused. I think it is really coming to the fore. So I think over the next year or so, I think those issues really would be hashed out within the Japanese government's debate.
Is there an expectation within the Japanese government that being part of the Quad would help Japan in the East China Sea with the Senkaku/Diaoyu Islands?
I do think that Japan, not just being part of Quad, but then also facilitate some of those initiatives and keep being one of the louder voice in upholding those international norms, particularly on the not to resort use of force to change the status quo part, really kind of helps Japan's cause in terms of keeping East China Sea issue on the international spotlight. Because I think over the years in the past, certainly PRC has tried to contextualize East China Sea as a Japan-China bilateral issue. But then that's not how Japan sees this. Japan sees that how China behaves in East China Sea in relation to bilaterally with Japan in terms of try to asserting its sovereignty in a very assertive way, it is really coming a very much more pronounced way in South China Sea. Because of the capacity of the regional contestant countries' Coast Guard capacity to kind of push back against those assertive behaviors. So I think Japan being a part of the Quad and then actually one of the main voices in the Quad, I think does help Japan's interest in making sure that East China Sea situation or situation over Senkaku Island doesn't get out of hand.
Guy, why is Australia now interested in the Quad when it wasn't so much before? What's changed over the last couple of years? Trade sanctions, trade restrictions being one of them, obviously. And what do you feel that Australia brings to the Quad that's unique and helps make the Quad more greater than the sum of its parts?
Yeah, thank you, Mary Kay, and again, thank you for asking me to be involved in this discussion. So I think as we look back over the last couple of years politically in Australia, there's obviously been a greater appetite in the current government to be a bit more forceful, pushing back against China, because as you will be well aware, the Australian economy has been relied on China, and it actually got us through the Asia financial crisis. So I think, though, as the points that Bonnie and Yuki have both made about, this is not in any way a containment strategy. This is about ensuring international norms, good governance. And I guess for us, particularly in the north of Australia, we are part of the Southeast Asia region. So the last thing that we want to see in this part of the world is fragile states become even more fragile, instability, particularly around in Indonesia, Timor-Leste, the Pacific Islands. So I think the combination of the political will here, the trade sanctions, as you've mentioned, but also, of course, underpinned by our very strong and long alliance with the US. So, 70 years this year is the anniversary of ANZUS Treaty with the United States. Japan relationship with in the defence and national security space with Australia is really developing quite rapidly. And, India is another obvious democracy in the region and to share the common norms and values that we've been talking about. So those combination of factors, I think, is what really has made the Morrison government particularly kind of more forward-leaning on the Quad and initiatives to try and counter what China is doing with territorial disputes, questioning international norms, things like that. To your second part of the question, I might just talking from a defence national security perspective, Australia obviously being in many ways a kind of a junior partner in that side of things in the Quad. I think there are two aspects that Australia can bring. One is in the training and exercising space, military training and exercising I'm talking about here. So as you'll know, Australia was recently or has been invited to the Indian Naval Exercise Malabar. What Australia really can offer all Quad members is quite a unique training and exercising location in the region, given our large geographic space, relatively low population, size of training ranges, access to the various types of training available, and also on top of exercising and training, also ability to test kind of evolving weapons and systems and platforms and things like that. So, for example, we've recently just seen exercise Talisman Sabre in Australia, which had about 17,000 personnel from a range of countries. India is going to be in that exercise. Sorry, you lost me?
Go ahead. You went silent for a moment, but keep going.
Sorry. I was just saying, so exercise Talisman Sabre, which is one of our largest multilateral exercises with the US, Japan and others. So the Defence Minister of Australia has noted that India will be invited to that in 2023. So that's a great step forward. So I think what we can bring is that platform for Quad members to really be able to build that military interoperability and, shared maritime domain awareness, all of those kind of things. The other thing I think that we can bring just quickly is if you want to see it as capacity building in this part of the world. And I know that Japanese Defence Minister Kishi has noted recently about Australia's influence in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and that he sees that we can take a leadership role in that part of the region. So I think as the Quad works to coordinate efforts and build defence and security capacity of smaller states in this part of the world, I think Australia can really add some value there because of our location, but also our long history of engagement in the region and understanding of it. And those smaller states really can make a difference, as we've seen recently with Samoa's decision to block a Chinese port development. The more we can help to counter what the Chinese are doing in that space, I think, that's where we can add a bit of value.
So you called recently you said it's time to establish an Indo-Pacific Maritime Law Enforcement Center that would operate innovative maritime law enforcement programs to build partner capacity across the Indo-Pacific, based in Darwin, and would be sort of an Indo-Pacific watchtower. Do you think of this as being part of the Quad's activities?
Absolutely. So I could see something like that. So that, again, so that's going to that capacity building or that soft diplomatic kind of efforts. So I think Australia has experience in establishing and running various similar type of centres, like the JCLEC in Indonesia and other regional capacity building initiatives. So I could certainly see that having a centre that really focuses on building capacity, understanding of civil maritime capabilities and law enforcement activities amongst regional countries is certainly something the Quad could lead. Why not?
Okay. So moving over to South Asia and Aparna. So as we've talked about, China's government sometimes slams the Quad as an attempt to contain China. But Indians might argue that the way China's been building out its Belt and Road Initiative in Pakistan and Iran, on Myanmar's west coast, and Sri Lanka's port of Hambantota feels uncomfortably like encircling to some people in India. And then there's the fact that India has now shifted 50,000 more troops to its undemarcated border with China in Ladakh, where clashes broke out last year, and Chinese troops occupied territory that India sees as its own in the same general area where a war broke out in 1962. So there's this tension on the border with about 200,000 Indian troops all told now, and a not insignificant number of Chinese troops who are building roads to the border and building up new towns so they can more easily push forward and sort of salami slice when the opportunity presents itself. But at the same time, there's robust trade continuing between the two countries, almost $100 billion a year worth before COVID, with China's imports to India being about 3 times the volume of India's to China. But still, China is India's number 2 trading partner. So it's a very long preamble to my question, which is, as Indians, both the Indian public and the Indian government looks at this complicated relationship with China, how has all this changed calculations about how much India should embrace being part of the Quad?
Thank you, Mary Kay, and thank you to the Asia Society Northern California for inviting me to speak, and everyone who joined. So coming to your question, India has always, I would say going back to the late 1950s, early 1960s, Indian leaders have always viewed China as the primary threat. One, because of the border dispute, and because the only war India has ever lost is the war to China. And China took over sort of about 15,000 square miles in 1962. But over the years, the view became in the 1990s, as many other countries, including U.S., Japan, that if we build economic relations with China, then maybe we can put the border dispute on the back burner, and Chinese aggression may be tempered by the prospect of a 1.2 billion Indian consumer market. That has changed especially in the last, I would say, 9 years. And the change has come primarily starting 2012 with the rise of Xi Jinping. In the last 9 years, China has attempted to take over Indian territory at least 4 times along their border. 2020 was the 4th time. Each time there's been salami slicing, or 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and China ends up with more territory than it had earlier. India has been slow to respond as a democracy, as building its capabilities. And so the infrastructure building, sending troops is always, it's always a work in progress. This sort of continued aggression of China, despite India's attempts to build economic ties with the country and try and follow a semi-hedging strategy where it would not get too close to the United States or the Western countries so as not to upset China, has changed. And so what India has been sort of, in the early iteration, a number of panelists all the panelists mentioned, in 2007 when Quad first started, in a few months, most of the countries backed off, including India. In 2017, it was 5 years after 2012. Twice, the Chinese had already tried to take over Indian territory. Despite India's economic relations and diplomatic, things hadn't changed. So there was so Delhi decided that maybe the other way is you need to ally with countries, or let's put it this way, align with countries. India doesn't really like the word ally. And align closer with the United States and with Japan and Australia. India has very deep economic ties and diplomatic ties with all three countries. It's and security and defense relationships. All are part of the Quad. The one difference would be the other three are treaty allies. India is not a treaty ally of the United States or of the other two. And that has to do with India's own preferences and reluctance to join a security alliance. But I'll stop there in case you have another question, and then.
Yeah, I do. I have one follow-up of my own, and then I'm going to throw Bonnie's at you. But well, actually, Taiwan, India and Taiwan. What's the scope for cooperation there?
I think Bonnie knew the answer when she threw the question at me. I think all of us know the answer. India has a historical reluctance to send its troops outside of the Indian subcontinent, except under UN peacekeeping. So I do not see India sending troops, to defend Taiwan. The maximum I would see is Indian Navy conducting freedom of navigation operations. Now, you mentioned that 50,000 troops had moved to the border. India has also sent aircraft carriers and a number of ships for the Malabar exercises recently. Now, if those ships also participate in a Quad freedom of navigation or in Indo-Pacific freedom of navigation, not just in South China Sea, but closer to to Taiwan, that would be the maximum India would do. But unfortunately, while India has relations with Taiwan and supports Taiwan, there is, as of now, no way that India will send its troops or its Navy that far out.
So the follow-up I wanted to ask is, within India's own neighborhood, China's been investing a lot in the China-Pakistan economic corridor, but Pakistan's been kind of rethinking it. To what extent do you think there's room for that relationship to shift, to cool a little bit, and India's relationship with Pakistan to become different, maybe a little bit closer? Is there any opportunity for that?
Unfortunately, I don't think there's an opportunity for it to get better. I think the maximum we can have is what has happened over the last few months. In February of this year, India and Pakistan signed a ceasefire agreement, the seventh ceasefire in the last 7 decades. And that ceasefire has held despite certain skirmishes on the border. And so I think as long as the ceasefire holds, and it becomes a cold peace over a period of time, that's the maximum we can expect. Coming to China's investment in BRI, in CPEC, we must remember, China has invested almost $60 billion in Pakistan. 1/5 of Pakistan's debt is owed to China. There are about 40,000 Pakistani students studying. China is very close to Pakistan. The Pakistani military intelligence view China as an ally, the close ally. So I don't see that break happening. And part of that relationship is India. India-China antagonism from Pakistan's point of view means China will support Pakistan. India-US bonhomie means that the US will not support Pakistan in India-China. There is the India factor will prevent, closer relations between US-Pakistan or India-Pakistan.
Okay. I'm going to go to audience questions, and a reminder to those of you who might like to ask a question but haven't written it in yet, please do. So one question here is, Kevin Rudd made it clear that China is trying to influence the Quad through direct economic pressure against Australia. How can Australia and indeed the other members of the Quad navigate economic damage China could cause while making a meaningful contribution to the Quad's aims in the region? Edward Seymour, Australian student at this is from Edward Seymour, an Australian student at the U.S. Navy War College in Rhode Island. I guess, I mean, this is about Australia, but it's really about economic damage in general. China's made it a practice, at least at times, to use economic relationships for political leverage. Who wants to take this one? I'm going to throw it to you, Guy, if nobody else.
Okay, sure, no problem. Yeah, no, that's fine. So look, I think, and Aparna touched on this, I think one of the, and it kind of goes back to the point that I was talking about in our regional kind of neighbours, is the China, the kind of the debt trap diplomacy and the use of economic, under the guise of economic aid. I think that's something that obviously we are very keen to see less of in the region, because it really doesn't help those developing nations and those states build their own internal resilience and their internal capacity. So I think that we have seen that in Australia. We've seen attempts at that not on a different level, but through Australian wine trade sanctions, all sorts of things. So I think though the Australian government doesn't have an appetite to kind of let that be any way to wedge us or leverage us from, as we talked about earlier, ensuring that we have those kind of international norms and values adhered to in the region, which have underpinned stability and security for 70 odd years. So I don't think that the Australian government at the moment has any appetite to kind of let that economic driver be a wedge from our broader objectives. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, another question. The country that doesn't get much attention despite its size is Indonesia, which is also a democracy whose participation seems key to the Quad's success, but it's been very reluctant to be seen as opposing China in any way. Should or can current Quad members do more to try to bring Indonesia into the fold? And I'll expand the question just slightly to say, I mean, obviously ASEAN in general is a pretty big region, and like, how can the Quad effectively engage ASEAN? I mean, to what extent is there room to do that? Or, I mean, ASEAN's been sort of trying to play a delicate balancing act over the decades in its relationship with China. What do you see being possible? And I see Yuki nodding. Do you want to take this? And then Bonnie.
Yeah, because I think Japan has, with the United States also, has seen Southeast Asia as really the key in the facilitating the effort that Quad countries would like to press to realize the free and open Indo-Pacific. But then also Japan, like I said in my initial answer to your question, Japan also kind of has felt Southeast Asia's dilemma, but in a very different way. Geographically, obviously, it's a lot closer. But then, economic power-wise, Japan has not been exposed to that much of a, to the level of the brunt economic, I guess, coercive diplomacy that China has been seem to be conducting in that region as. But at the same time, though, it does have it did get the taste of that, how China is often not hesitant to use economic tools to force its will upon themselves. So I think Japan can sympathize, absolutely. But then I think that is why whenever Japanese leaders talks about free and open Indo-Pacific, they do also, at the backhand comment of it, is that it's quick, they quickly do add that they want to facilitate this concept and a cooperation on this concept while continue to respect ASEAN centrality. And they do recognize that diversity in that region and the different countries in Southeast Asia have a different types of relationship. But then with the countries such as Philippines and Vietnam, that does have a little bit greater concerns, security concerns when it comes to Coast Guard for the South China Sea claims. Japan does try to provide a support. And then I think they are doing that with Indonesia as well. So I think Japan's approach is really working with other Quad countries, U.S., Australia, and India, to offer that alternative to Southeast Asia when it comes to economic development projects or infrastructure development projects. And you often hear Japan and other Quad partner talks about quality infrastructure as opposed to the quantity or size of the infrastructure projects. And I think that is the approach that Japan has been trying to take.
Ani?
I think Yuki's pretty much covered the waterfront, but I would say that from the beginning, ASEAN has been concerned about the Quad because they felt this posed a challenge to ASEAN's centrality. And I think, to be honest, we should all say that ASEAN has not been a very effective organization when it comes to dealing with security challenges in the region. To be fair, that's not why it was created. But we can look at what's going on with Myanmar. The organization is just not being very effective in dealing with that challenge within its own organization, not to mention dealing with challenges like China. So every member of the Quad pays attention to and even maybe lip service to ASEAN centrality. We saw Secretary of Defense Austin, who was recently in Singapore, give the Fullerton lecture and talk about how the Quad was complementary, of course, to ASEAN and reinforce ASEAN centrality. But at the end of the day, most of these countries that are in the Quad have a very close engagement with Indonesia individually. Certainly Australia being in the lead, the closest geographically, but the United States, Japan, India also having relations with all of the ASEAN members, but Indonesia in particular. And let's remember that Indonesia is the ASEAN chair this year, so especially playing an important role. So I think we'll see more activity there. But I'm not sure that the right solution is to have the Quad as a composition of 4 countries to engage with Indonesia. There should be just a lot of flexibility. Sometimes it will be 1 country or 2 or 3. There's these different geometrical configurations, if you will, that sometimes are more relevant than others. So the Quad may not always be the right geometrical solution. But where there are shared interests, then I think in Southeast Asia, generally, we will see more. And Yuki has rightfully highlighted infrastructure as one of the top priorities, providing alternatives to loans from China. But as I mentioned, also solutions for COVID-19 economic recovery. These are issues that Southeast Asia really attaches priority to.
Yeah. So bouncing off of your comment about different geometries might be appropriate for different situations, there's a question that asks, what are the prospects, if at all, of there being an economic dimension of cooperation between Quad states beyond what already exists bilaterally? Anyone want to take that?
I'll take a first stop at that. If you look at the Quad virtual leader statement that came out after the Quad Leaders Summit, they highlighted three different areas, and obviously COVID vaccine production and the distribution cooperation was really the pronounced aspect of it. But then other 2 were quite important as well. And then not so much talked about, but what I do think is really important moving forward is this working group on emerging technologies, because that does lead to sustainable economic development for many of the countries that the Quad has a relationship on a bilateral basis. And then I think Bonnie's absolutely right that sometimes it's probably not going to be Quad versus Indonesia, or like a Quad versus Cambodia, or Quad versus Vietnam. But then sometimes, U.S. takes the lead, sometimes Australia takes the lead, sometimes India is the lead, sometimes Japan's the lead. So whichever the countries in the Quad, I think Quad, the great strength of the Quad is that it's flexible in a way that any of the country that has, I guess, a better or deeper relationship or a better way in any of those countries that each of 4 countries have bilateral relations with, they can go in, and other 3 countries can supplement that effort. They're based on close policy coordination. So that is the way that I see the Quad evolves, that it's not always a Quad as a block, but it's more a nimble and flexible entity where, depending on the situation, any of these countries can take a lead. And it's never going to be like this really formalized Quad versus ASEAN kind of institutionalized relationship.
Guy, did I see you have your hand up?
Yeah, Mary Kay, thank you. I think, yeah, what Yuki said is spot on. And I think the other aspect to that, and particularly in Australia, that has been demonstrated during COVID, is our requirement to diversify supply chains more across a whole range of sectors. And so, while not suggesting that the Quad could, make its own internal supply chain kind of arrangements, but I think there's certainly in Australia an appetite now for looking for those alternate supply chains and working either together as a Quad or bilaterally or trilaterally or however that might work. I think that's something that would be interesting to explore, because certainly Australia has discovered that we've really become very reliant on China as a large both export and import provider for us. So I think that's one thing to explore. And just very quickly on Indonesia, yeah, look, I agree completely with everything that Bonnie and Yuki said. Of course, Australia does have a pretty deep and long relationship with Indonesia, given our location and particularly in the defence space. But I agree. I don't think that Indonesia, particularly again in the defence side of things, is going to be looking to do, Quad only related activities. But that idea of using that group, and whether it's one country stepping in and stepping out and building that strength is really important. And then I think also with obviously the current state that Indonesia is going through with its COVID response, which is getting worse and worse by the day, and sympathies go out to all our Indonesian friends. But I think there's a real opportunity for all of our countries, whether it's as a Quad, i.e. through the vaccine concept or separately, to fill the void that otherwise will be filled by China. So I think that response and helping that initial response to COVID, but then the economic path out of that is a way to really develop much stronger relationships with a country that, don't forget, has a size, population pretty much very close to the US. So it's a very large, influential player in the region.
Yeah. There are a couple of questions that are related to what we've just been talking about in terms of kind of who does what in the region. So one of them is, what are the implications of the Quad for the existing regional architecture where China is a member? The ASEAN Regional Forum, or ARF, and the East Asian Summit process on the security side, and APEC on the economic. And then a separate question from a separate person in the audience is, what role does the UN play in this complex of issues? Is the Quad capable of leveraging the UN to resolve some of the issues the panelists have discussed today? Who would like to take either or both of those questions?
I think I may talk a little bit about what the Quad versus other existing regional architecture. Okay. But I'm just going to have to leave the UN question up. But then all I can say, the only point that I would make on those questions would be, look, Quad, like I said, I think the greatest strength of the Quad is nimble, it's agile, it's versatile, it's flexible, and then it's really not a formalized arrangement. I mean, we do have, the 4 countries have different levels of consultation in that combination, but it's not a locked in, not really based on any treaty or anything, that it does, that it has that, it doesn't contradict necessarily with the other regional architectures that already exist. If nothing else, I think the group of 4 can be the, I guess, the force multiplier if worked appropriately with the regional architecture. And then I think in terms of a UN, UN definitely does have a role to play in a sense that I guess like the biggest example will be what's been happening in the South China Sea, that everybody, all the claimant countries are based on their claims on UNCLOS. So I think UN does have a role to play in clarifying the, I guess, the values and norms that needs to be upheld. But then I guess the biggest weakness of the United Nations, it does not have not necessarily an enforcement mechanism. And then I think that may be where the Quad comes in, where it doesn't really explicitly enforce those laws, but then really be the force behind this, rally behind this, I guess the interest of all the countries in the region to continue to uphold those universal values and norms that UN has helped to create.
Great. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask the last question and give each of you about a minute, minute and a half, 2 minutes at the outside, but try to keep it shorter. And that is, if the Quad succeeds in a way that's meaningful to your country, 10 years out, what is the best case scenario? What is the worst case scenario in terms of how China responds? Bonnie, let me start with you.
Well, it's an important question, Mary Kay, and I think that the response from the perspective of the United States, I think actually is quite similar to that of the other countries, that all these 4 countries would like to see China change its behavior to participate in rulemaking, but in a way that doesn't undermine the rules-based order, that China and other countries would come to some understanding, for example, where they disagree in some of the provisions of UNCLOS, and that in the South China Sea, China would allow other smaller countries, claimants, to access their resources, including fishing and energy, and not interfere, that China would contribute to addressing challenges in the region in a constructive way that doesn't put China's interests ahead of all the interests of all of the other players. Essentially to compel Xi Jinping to recalibrate, to recognize that some of China's policies have actually caused a blowback in many countries around the world. So I think that's really, that's the best case. The worst case is that China ends up concluding this is really a containment strategy. And it decides that the Quad is really threatening China's sovereignty and its core interests, sovereignty being one of those, but that affects not only Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Tibet, and Taiwan, but possibly also South China Sea and East China Sea, and maybe eventually parts of the Indian Ocean. China's core interests are certainly expanding. And so China could decide to adopt a serious pushback strategy against the Quad, double down on the kind of behavior that we see today. And maybe adopt more aggressive strategies and policies, including potential use of force to solve its territorial disputes, which would, in the case of India, be catastrophic, and in the case of Taiwan, would end up in a wider conflict that would draw in the United States.
Yuki, how about what would you add to that from Japan's perspective?
So in terms of Chinese response, best case and worst case scenario, I pretty much agree with everything that Bonnie said. So I'm not going to even go there. But for Japan, I think the best outcome would be that Quad cooperation will not stop at just regular consultation amongst different ministers and different players, that somehow in a very soft way, even with the still maintaining the flexibility that it currently has, it becomes somewhat, I would say somewhat, because this is a functional word, somewhat institutionalized in a way that the four countries identifies the issues that all four countries have a shared interest, and they agree that the policy coordination on those issues on those policy areas are important, and they can coordinate approaches to achieve those goals. So that will be the best case scenario for me, which hopefully would turn into some specific policy initiatives that are coming out from this specific particular framework. Worst case would be it will just devolve into another annual talk shop or biannual talk shop where, you know, ministers will meet, talk, there may be a joint statement or two, but then nothing gets done. I think that will be the worst outcome for Japan.
Okay. Guy?
Yeah, look, again, I'm not going to cover ground that both Bonnie and Yuki have done. I think, look, in a nutshell for Australia, the best, you know, a best case scenario for how China responds to the Quad or to what the Quad has been talking about is, yeah, obviously, as Bonnie said, you know, a more constructive engagement kind of in the region within those kind of rules-based order. I think the infrastructure developments that are happening in the region are really important that Yuki spoke about previously. I mean, there's a lot of work there that I think, you know, we really need to look at and see how it's almost undermining the stability of those states. But also, you know, from an Australian economic perspective, just seeing a more stable or a continued stability in the region and continued kind of fair trading approaches, because, you know, at the end of the day, everybody wins from that. So I think we'll see, and I think, you know, we will see that return to normal. But that's you know, from the best case. I think I agree with Yuki that the worst case for the Quad would be it just turns into, like a lot of other these forums, something that doesn't actually have any teeth or something that doesn't really make significant progress. And that doesn't need to be in the defence military space. There's lots of initiatives in the humanitarian side, in the economic side, in the social justice side, etc., that the Quad could really make a significant difference. Because we talked about ASEAN regional forums, etc. I mean, we all know ASEAN hasn't got a great reputation for getting things done. So yeah, that's probably the worst case, I think.
Okay, and Aparna, you get the last word on this, and if you keep it to a minute and a half, that would be great.
Sure, of course. And I agree with everything Bonnie said about U.S. China and the best case, worst case in the broader context, and actually with Yuki on the worst case and worst case about Quad. It shouldn't become a talk shop, and hopefully it becomes institutionalized. From India's point of view, I guess the best case would be that China actually discusses the border dispute instead of taking over more territory, which it has done. Normally, China's way of negotiating with India has been take territory and then keep it, and then take more territory and keep it. If sort of the best case is that in 10 years, Quad makes China rethink that strategy. So in some ways, hoping to convince India to, you know, to go back to hedging, which India may not, but sort of that would be the best case. Worst case would be that China believes that Quad is a talk shop, and therefore it can continue its aggression on the Indian continental landmass, which means India will focus less on the maritime domain, less on Indo-Pacific, and less on the Quad.
Thank you, Bonnie, Yuki, Guy, and Aparna for a really interesting, meaty discussion on this critically important topic. Thank you all for listening, and Margaret, back to you.
Yes, thank you, Mary Kay, Bonnie, Yuki, Guy, and Aparna. There's lots to monitor, and we will be doing that at Asia Society. So keep an eye on our website. We're going to be rolling out our full Seeking Truth Through Facts U.S. China series. Program 3 of 8 is coming up next. We're offering a mix of formats, including virtual and in-person events, both in San Francisco and in Silicon Valley. Our thanks to our advisory board and our sponsors for supporting all of our programs. And if you are interested in helping us develop ideas or sponsor events, please reach out to our team. And if you're not already a member of one of our 13 centers around the world, please join us. You'll be given early access to ticket sales. That's when we start hosting events in person, and that is going to be soon. Now, for those joining our VIP reception, we're going to continue this discussion. Click over to the second link you received before the program. A big thank you again to our speakers, And to our team, Rexel, Angela, James, and Michael, and also to our interns, and from all of us at the Northern California Center, stay safe.